Okay, so President Scott did say that she was going to pop back in after her connection was able to resolve itself. So perhaps we can start with introductions of who is here. I will do a quick reading of the names, and if folks want to just acknowledge the organization they're with. I think it's actually just one organization, so it might be pretty easy. We have Katie Hasselwander. Katie, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm with City Council.
My name is BJ Scanlon, Council staff. Mary Lupian.
City Council East District.
Willie Lightfoot.
City Council Vice President at Large.
Condoleezza Brown.
Deputy City Clerk.
Ellie Dentinger.
Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester.
Barbara Rivera.
Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester.
Jasmine Regler.
Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester.
Jose Pio.
Northwest District Councilman.
Mitch Gruber.
Hi, everyone at large.
Liz.
Liz McGriff, Citywide Tenant Union.
Lachey Harris.
City Council South District.
Ryan.
I'm sorry.
This is Ryan with the Tenant Union.
And I think that's Caroline.
Good afternoon, everybody. President Loretta Scott, Legislative Aide.
Okay. So I think we had set out an agenda of questions that Council had posed to the Citywide Tenant Union. Those have been submitted, and I think probably it would be appropriate if one of the representatives from the Tenant Union wanted to walk through their responses, because you requested the meeting to be able to talk through those responses and provide any additional information. So I would turn it over to the Tenant Union.
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to thank you for doing a follow-up meeting and for an opportunity to discuss the Tenant Power Platform. I also want to thank you for setting up court legal representation for many of the tenants that are going to go through this tsunami of evictions in our court system. And we look forward to working together in the next 6 to 8 months to make the right to counsel a permanent fixture in our housing court when tenants face eviction. Under the current system, tenants have to rely on the lawyer, the landlord's lawyer, because they have to work out a deal before they go back to court. So what typically happens is the tenants kind of side with the lawyer because they don't know their rights. So what happens is they get a lot of judgment and more debt, rather than bringing up the issues of habitability, and those things they don't get addressed through the court system. So, I don't know if anybody has any questions regarding the right to counsel. If there are no questions, then we'll move on to Jasmine to give a discussion about good cause. And we're also going to address the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, as well as the Emergency Tenant Protection Act.
Thank you, Liz. So yes, I'm going to be talking about good cause. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about, because we get a lot of questions about it, a concern about problem tenants. And what if there is good cause? Is it going to be harder to evict problem tenants? So good cause would not affect those problem tenants. There already is in place a process for landlords to handle tenants that are a problem. I'll use a personal experience. Where my mom lives, she rents, it's a 3-family home. So there's 2 other tenants there. One of the tenants has decided to basically set up a cat shelter in the backyard. Now, although it's not fully stipulated in the lease that you can't do that, it is making it uncomfortable living for the other tenants. So the other tenants have complained to the property manager. They keep things in writing, and the property manager keeps a dialogue of all the complaints that have come in. And they were able to use that to now not renew the tenant's lease because she is making it uncomfortable for the other tenants to live there. So there are ways still to evict problem tenants. That's not going to change. What Good Cause would do would just give more protections to those good tenants. So Good Cause we still would be able to evict if there was criminal activity going on, if a person was in violation of their lease. So a landlord can write out the lease however they want to word it, and if a tenant signs it, they have to follow that. So if a tenant is in violation of that lease, you can also evict. And if a tenant is not paying the rent, but here's the one thing with it. If the tenant is able to still pay the rent, but not like a 30 or 40% increase, then that is not a reason to evict someone, just to up the rent. And we had someone who was going to speak, but since he's not here, I'll tell his story. His name is Marvin. He actually spoke, I believe, in January or February in front of City Council. He's a senior citizen. He's on a fixed income. He's moved about 6 times in the past 5 years. He spoke before y'all about his property manager going up by 40% on his rent. That day has come. The property manager do go up 40% on his rent. He was not able to afford it. Luckily, he has the support of St. Joe's and we allowed him to move in. But for people that don't have a St. Joe's like Marvin does, they would be left out on the street because it's not that they can't afford the rent, they just can't afford the dramatic rent increases. So with Good Cause, that would have stopped the property manager from increasing the rent 40%, and Marvin would have been able to stay in his apartment. So we want to have things like that so that people who are living, who can make a stable living, can continue to do that and not have to move every year, 2 years, anything like that. Are there any other like major concerns as far as passing Good Cause or any questions about it?
I have 2 questions, Jasmine.
Okay.
The first is just in regards to something that you said. I mean, you talked. I don't like the term problem tenants, so I'm not going to choose to use that term. But I think the point is that we've heard from landlords who say that Good Cause will make it more difficult to evict people that they feel they need to evict. Right? That's the general point there. And your response is that no, not the case for all these reasons. But your response includes the actual conduct of tenants that could allow for eviction even with a good cause. But what's the actual process? Which leads me to my second question, which is who would actually be the ones if Good Cause came to Rochester right now, who would actually be enforcing it? Because the research I've done has shown like Philadelphia has a Fair Housing Commission. New York City has things like a rent board. There's a lot of these different structures in place to be able to actually enforce and moderate and regulate these things. We don't have that here. So who would actually do the work?
Well, that's the thing. If we did agree that we are going to pass this, then we would have to form something. Right now, we don't have that because we don't even have Good Cause. As of up until now, it really hasn't even been something that has been thought about. So I think if we are thinking about going in that direction, we would have to form, like you said, a housing board or something so that if the city didn't want to take ownership of it, then we have another entity that can do it. So I think that's something that would be done in the process of implementing Good Cause.
So Good Cause eviction is not simply a matter of city council passing a proclamation or a law on the books that says we believe that tenants have a right to their home and that have a right to a home, and evictions are not allowed for this and that purpose. That's not what you're asking for. You're asking for the city council to actually set up a separate body, or potentially whether it's part of the city or the county or the courts, who knows, but you're asking for a separate body than one that currently exists to be able to set the ground rules and regulate the implementation of Good Cause.
Only if the city does, we have to figure out someone else that we could do. We could try the courts first to see if they would implement it, and then if that didn't happen, we would have to get creative and figure out a way.
And can I say something? This is Ryan. Can I say something as well?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should just be clear, Mitch, is that Tenants in Rochester already do have good cause, about 15 to 20% of tenants in public housing, tenants in Section 8, tenants with low-income housing tax credits. So there are specific buildings that already have it, and it's enforced through the courts. And what we found is tenants that have good cause and that are organizing their buildings like clockwork, their landlord tries to get them out, and they can't because of good cause. They try to get them out for retaliatory reasons, but they say housekeeping or some other minor issue, and it never holds up. So just to be clear is that some tenants have it, it's enforced through the courts, and the process has been successful at protecting those tenants.
Brian, thanks, that's really helpful. It's enforced through it's enforced through city court here in Rochester.
Right. So what we're proposing is the expansion of it. So all tenants have the right to renew their lease, make a complaint without the fear of being put out. So just to make it available for everybody. Now, at some point, if we're able to put together an extra layer of protection so tenants can access some sort of violations before it gets to court, that's very beneficial. But it's not a necessary condition because we've seen it be successful now. The problem is it just applies to a minority of tenants.
So can I ask a follow-up? Loretta, if you want to give me the hook at any point, you're welcome to. But until I do, I'm going to ask a follow-up. So right now, I'm a tenant, and I live in a building that you just described, Brian, one of the 15 to 20% of individuals who already have good cause, and presumably that's because some of the funding for these buildings comes from HUD or New York State or whichever the case may be. But I'm one of those tenants. I get evicted. My colleague Willie is a tenant in a duplex. There's no coverage or no good cause prevention. We both go on the same day to court. So what you're telling me is that the judge knows that I have good cause eviction because of where I live and knows that Willie doesn't, and therefore we're held to different standards when that judge hears our cases?
Can I just say, it kind of plays into if we had the right to counsel, then the lawyer that's representing those two tenants would know what the regulations are in that. So, so if we rely on the court system to know it, there isn't, unless you send out on a piece of paper, this is what you're eligible for. So in the court system's not set up that way. So with having the support of having the lawyer, then it would give the tenant the opportunity to advocate where they wouldn't know if they had good cause or not. They don't know. They just go to court because I'm supposed to go to the court on some, ridiculous reason why the landlord wants to evict me. So all these play into each other. You can't have one without the other. It supports both.
Sure, Liz, that makes perfect sense. That you can't have one without. I think I see the linkage between the right to counsel and good cause. But can I still just get clarity on the question that I asked? If Willie and I both get evicted, he lives in a duplex with no good cause protections. I live in a high rise that was funded with HUD money, and I technically have good cause protections. But to your point, Liz, I don't know that I do, and Willie doesn't know that he doesn't. We go to court, we're sitting there on the same day. How does the judge, what happens at that point? Do we get the same treatment or different treatment?
I mean, ultimately you get the same treatment, but if you, like Liz said, it's up for the tenant to raise the issue. And of course, we'd love to be in a situation where every tenant knows their rights. But the hope is, even if a tenant doesn't know all of their rights, that with legal counsel, they would be advised of all their rights and be able to raise that as a defense. So in the cases like many of you guys know, Pam Owens, who's been a vocal advocate for the tenants in her building at Manhattan Square, right? Conifer tried to put her out by claiming that she had grease on the stove, right? Obviously, that's not a major housekeeping violation. It's not a violation of other tenants' rights. It's not an actual good cause. She has good cause protections, right? So she had a lawyer, and her lawyer with her was able to effectively raise that. And of course, Conifer wouldn't put that before a judge because they would be humiliated before a judge putting that type of argument up. So it's not that every tenant knows their rights or that judges would treat them different, but we want every tenant to know their rights. And if they have a lawyer, hopefully all of their rights would be raised in those situations.
Ryan, is there any way to?
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Mitch, were you done?
Well, I guess I'll be done since two other people want to speak, but I'll add a coda to my thoughts, which is that only kind of reinforces to me that we can continue to work on these things as a council. But if we don't have a court system that is working with us in lockstep, it feels to me like we are entering an abyss without being able to find the real solutions, because the judge is the person in that case, I believe, who should know what rights apply to tenants. I mean, they are the ones who are ultimately meting out justice on these cases, and they're the ones who I think ought to know that. So we can pass the legislation, the lawyers can be there to help, but how do the judges not know?
So can we agree that we're basically supportive of the concept, but have concerns about the implementation mechanism?
That's personally, I fully support the idea of making sure that people should not be evicted for the wrong reasons. I believe in that 100%. I think we can legislate it all we want. If we don't have the courts on our side, that's troubling to me.
Okay, thanks. Councilmember Lupien.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. Ryan, do you feel like, well, I guess, this you may not know the answer, but it seems to me like it should be part of the conversation before the judge that a certain unit is covered under good cause. And certainly if we passed it citywide, this would have to be something that the judge would have awareness of, and it wouldn't fully land on the tenant to bring it up. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, under our proposal, 99% of the tenants would be covered. So I guess I'm not clear what the concern is, where the burden, the assumption would be every case would have it. So, so every judge would know that. So that'd just be like how almost every case, there has to be a certain type of service. The judges check it. The judges throw out cases that don't have certain types of proper service. It just becomes part of the process. I think what we have now is a patchwork, which makes it more difficult, and to create a fair, uniform system. I think that's what this moves towards.
Who's the 1% that's not covered?
Well, in the current proposal, the only exemption is for units that are less than 3 or less units that are owner occupied. So it would be if I own a duplex and the tenant was on the other side, but I own it. So it's not just an investor owned property, right? But it's actually owner occupied property. This would apply to the vast majority of properties which are completely investor owned.
Can you just talk a little bit about why that exemption exists?
In case, I can answer that. So in case, because I am in that situation, I live in an owner occupied. So it's like that because in owner occupied, they have the right to give the property over to their family. If their family needed to move in, then that would be a reasonable way to do eviction for the family.
I know there's a list of reasons, that you could put somebody out. And like one of them is if you're going to move into it or your family is going to move into it, non-payment of rent, that kind of thing. But is there a specific reason that it's like 3 or fewer units where the owner actually lives there that would be exempted? Just curious.
I mean, it can apply to everybody. It's just the main issues we've seen are in the investor owned, not in the more with the owner occupied. I don't think that's the main concern, but I think we'd be open to that conversation if people wanted to apply to those situations as well. But I think the main concern is our main concern is the investor owned properties.
And I think a thing to point out too is that it's very rare that we see evictions of owner occupied like duplexes, because what happened is the tenant that lives next door is literally your neighbor, and the empathy that you build when the person is your neighbor versus when the tenant lives in a different part of the state and you're just making profit off of them looks very different.
I want to say too, Mitch, that was a good point you made about what if one tenant does have good cause currently and one right now, and the problem that can create right now. I think that is a reason to push more for good cause, so that we won't have that problem, that judges would know that 99% of the people coming into the courts for eviction do have good cause. So instead of trying to figure out who does and who doesn't, let's just make it so that the majority of people do have it, so there's no second guessing about it.
Yeah, I don't think it's a thing that can be done in a vacuum by the legislative branch. I think that it requires partnership from the judiciary branch. That's all. That's the only point that I'm trying to make.
And I think we can always work to make judiciary branch better, but I just want you to hear that our experiences are when tenants have good cause, the judiciary system has been an effective way to keep people in for tenants that do have it. I just want to make that clear, is that, you know, some tenants, they'll just move out early and they don't, but when it has gone to court and they do have a lawyer and people actually have good cause, they've won their cases. But
Okay.
I understand the concern though.
Can we move on to the next item?
Barb, that's you.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk about a little bit about TOPA, the tenant's opportunity to purchase, and then I'm going to give it to Ryan, who's going to speak on the financial aspect of it. So TOPA is the tenant's opportunity to purchase, and it's the sale or foreclosure of a rental building in order to reverse the out-of-town investor takeover of our neighborhoods. It gives the tenants the first opportunity to purchase any rental building up for sale. This legislation would empower tenants to collectively take control of their homes and create permanently affordable housing that stabilizes both disinvested and gentrifying communities. So like I said, it gives tenants the ability to stay in their neighborhoods instead of being subject to displacement when buildings are sold. It makes it easier for nonprofit developers to acquire and preserve buildings and expand the stock of permanently affordable housing. And it reverses and dismantles racist housing policies, which we know that are usually owned by out of town white property owners, and that will make it mostly for Black and Brown communities to have the opportunity to own their properties. This goes into example for the Meggs and Monroe apartments, the 217 East Main apartments, and also I think the Cadillac goes into that too. Only because those property managers, they sold the property, someone else bought it, and they tried to do mass evictions, and they tried to put a bunch of tenants on the street, and instead of just working with the tenants and making it better for them to stay there and affordable. This could be a way to decommodifying housing and build community wealth. It gives tenants ownership. It can promote shared equity and the creation of community wealth as a response to racist disinvestment. And tenants should also have the opportunity to assign purchase rights to a qualified nonprofit developer, a property manager, someone who will help keep maintaining the building. And that will go through the Mutual Housing Association. That would allow tenants the opportunity to make the decisions and create tenant control. And it provides extra stability and ensure permanent affordability for all tenants. And it creates housing programs like for rental co-ops, and it'll be placed into a community land trust. So I'm gonna hand that over to Ryan, and he'll go more in depth into the financial part.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to us is for, of course, tenants to have the first right to purchase the buildings that they're living in, because the default tenant situation is that tenants are paying somebody else's mortgage, an investor's mortgage, so they're building equity off the tenants, right? So it's kind of often entrenches the power dynamic that already exists in our system and making it worse. We want to promote equity, but more than just the right, of course, we want the actuality. So it's important that there's a complementary to the right are the programs that are set up in the financing. So everybody really has that right. And I think our main inspiration and model is from Washington, D.C., which has had this for 40 years. So not only do they have all tenants in the city have the first right to purchase their buildings when they go up for sale, but they have the tenant purchase and assistance program where in every situation where the building goes up for sale, the tenants have access to financial assistance. So they can acquire low interest loans to buy their building. And usually if it's a multifamily housing that it's a relatively small fee to buy one's own unit. So that's not the main barrier, but it's the financing for the tenant association to buy their whole building if it's a multifamily building. In addition, the technical assistance, so the lawyers ready-made for the process, and they built that in, and for tenant advocates to come in and support and take people through the process. So it's not just you get a letter in the mail that you have these rights, but you can talk with somebody that can take you through how that works and how to set those situations up for success. As far as the specific financing that supports those types of programs to make the TOPA a success, the way it works in DC is, so there's the typical loan dollars that are given to developers right now. For-profit developers access city loan dollars on affordable housing projects through CDBG funding, home funding. Loans are given out for major developments. As we've worked with Council on through with Landsman and Conifer and many of the other major developers. And the idea would be prioritizing those development money, one, for these type of programs. But the second piece of it is eventually creating a special, robust, dedicated funding source. And the way that it works in Washington, D.C. is they've created a housing trust fund that has a focus on that. And the way they generate dedicated revenue to the housing trust fund is through a small real estate transfer tax. So a small fee on real estate transfers, a deed transfer tax. In that case, depending on how much, then it's 1%, that's 1.4%, and this generates the revenue. And for them, the fund is so lucrative, they only even use 15% of it towards the TOPA. But I think we could potentially generate the revenue. The equivalent in New York State is something like the mortgage recording tax. 30 of the 50 something counties already do it. Cities do it, like Yonkers. So there are potential dedicated revenue sources that are outside of the federal funds and the general fund that I think that can set up for success. But even reallocation of existing funding would be enough, I think, to get the program started in a successful way. The other potential startup funding would be the tenant union has been participating with the city in the anti-displacement learning network with Enterprise. And we're at the process of applying for the $1 million. I think in August, the city's officially going to put in its application, end of the month or September. And then we're reaching growing consensus of a housing trust fund as one way to go in that direction. So we do think that there's ways to set up for success. We have the models from Washington, D.C., and we do have the funding sources, some of the existing reallocation sources, and some unique general ways to generate revenue as well.
I have a question. Ryan, can you walk us through, what would make a person eligible, like as if, based on the model you were mentioning, for the TOPA, what steps would they have to have in place, and what would make them eligible, and how long is the eligibility good for? So for example, I could be renting from a landlord for 6 months. Maybe I'm not interested in buying it right away. My lease expires, I'm a holdover tenant, but then I like to qualify for the TOPA eligibility. How does that work?
So the way it works is when a building goes up for sale, the owner must send a letter to the tenants, and they have a certain amount of time to exercise their rights. And there's different phases to the process. We have a handout that goes into it in a lot of detail, but just to summarize, usually you have 30 to 45 days to reply with your interest to buy, another period of time to enter into a contract. But then at the same time, if you're not wanting or in a position to buy, you also have the ability to assign your rights to a qualified developer or some other housing partner in the community that tenants can go and talk to other tenants and be like, well, this agency or this developer or this owner has shown that they have a good track record, and they could assign it to the owner on the basis of certain conditions. So that they mutually agree to, that could be beneficial to the tenant. So the idea is to put the tenant in the driver's seat and not, a free-for-all system where, like talking earlier today with a woman who has no C of O and has an owner from Australia, right? Just a totally horrific, chaotic situation. So trying to prevent those. So even if the tenant doesn't want to buy it, they can assign it to somebody that will work with them on some future plan that will be beneficial to them as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I sit here and I'm thinking, and I think this is a great idea, but I'm also thinking about how developers and businesses can exploit tenants that's in this situation. Does DC have something in place to prevent that from happening?
Can you say a little bit more about the specific exploitation you're concerned about? Is it from the seller or from the buyer? You want to say a little bit more about your
Say, for example, I'm a tenant and I want to, have my right to put in a bid or, to use the TOPA benefit, but I don't have the funds. I want a designated developer to use that right on my behalf. But that developer may not, they may say they have, my benefits in their interest, but that changes. They only, use me to get that deal.
Right.
So what protections are in place to protect from that happening?
So I think there's two ways. One is, I think the way it works in DC is there are a set of qualified developers. So it's not just anybody off the street, sending them a letter in the mail saying, I'm going to promise you the sky, and, sign some agreement that's not in the tenant's agreement. So, I think that case, the city actually says, these are developers that have some track record. So if the tenants don't know. And the second is, even in the assignment case, we would want to set tenants up with a lawyer. So if they were to sign an agreement with a developer that's going to work with them, they would sign some sort of agreement that's in their favor, as opposed to someone who's just sharking the tenants for something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for answering that.
Ryan, is there any length of time that tenants would, through this legislation, that the developers would need to keep as tenants? Or, we don't have good cause right now. Like, say TOPA is separate from good cause, would they be required to keep them as tenants for like a year or 2 years if they sign their rights away?
The way it works in DC is the tenants have the option to assign their rights. They could do it with 0 conditions, or they could do it with many conditions. So it's really up to that type of negotiation, but there's nothing built into it where the tenants say, I want to assign my rights to this developer to take over. But you have to take over under these conditions. That's really a negotiation between the tenants and the potential developer.
So what is the mechanism? Would we, the city, be passing a law that says you may not sell a building with more than 4 units without first notifying the occupants of the opportunity to purchase? Is that the kind of thing that you're looking for? And if so, then who is responsible for that implementation structure, looking at what the conditions of that arrangement are and whether or not they uphold it and so forth?
I can just say in the case of DC, they passed an ordinance, and the ordinance says that the tenants have the right of first refusal. So there's a process where you have to send an initial letter, and the ground rules of that process. The landlord, the city is going to be notified of it, and the landlord is going to then send the letter to the tenants. Or actually, I'm sorry, the city actually sends the letter to the tenants in DC. And then that's where the process begins. As far as enforcement, I'm not exactly sure, but my assumption is that there are penalties if, the landlord sells and just totally skirts the process without giving any options. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I think in this case, the notice actually comes from the city. The city sends, these are your rights in the situation, the first notice.
Are there any parameters to sale price when offered on the market? The landlord wants to sell it. Is there anything that identifies at what price it has to be sold or offered to the tenants versus put on the market?
So essentially the parameters are that, the tenants and the owner could negotiate a price. But also if they felt like the price was above market value, that they're trying to subvert the process and not, you can appeal to an independent appraisal, right? To say, well, if they want to sell it for under market value, that's up to the owner, but you can't just subvert the process by saying, well, I'm going to sell it, I'm going to offer it to you above market value, but then I'm going to sell it to somebody else for market value. So in the case of, if the offer that the owner made seemed like it wasn't a good faith offer, there's a whole process of appealing for an independent appraisal, but the sales are around the principle of market value.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jose.
I'm sorry, I have a couple of things because I think most of the topics you bring up, I agree with in theory, but in reality, it's kind of tough because let's say I'm an investor and I need fast cash because something happened to my whoever loved one and I need to pay cash for it. Now I need to sell this house. You're telling me I have to wait 30, 45 days for someone to get funding put in place. Then it takes 60 days to close on the house. That's a lot of waiting when I could have just sold it cash to somebody to get my money quickly to pay for whatever. So there's a lot in there. I agree with Topa. I think that tenants should have the opportunity to purchase the home. But me as a homeowner, for you to tell me I have to give this house to somebody or I have to sell this house to somebody, I'd have a kind of a problem with that just because the free market is the free market for a reason. And I believe that, houses right now are going for well over appraisal prices, especially for cash. So that's one thing I have right there. The other thing is, are we doing any kind of outreach to, you are the tenant union, right? Your job is to unionize tenants. So what type of unionizing are you doing for tenants to teach them about, number one, being a good tenant? Sorry, some people don't like to hear bad tenants, but there's a lot of bad tenants. So how to be a good tenant, how to budget your money, how to make it so that if your rent does go up, you can afford it, how to fix your credit. What are you doing as the citywide tenant union to help tenants? In that case, be proactive about it instead of just waiting for the city council to pass any legislation.
Can I answer the first one?
Go ahead.
Okay, so you're saying about if you owned property. So one, if you have additional property other than where you live, that's your investment property. So one, you should see that as a privilege, because if you did have that, if we take the normal person, if they, giving your same situation, if they had issues with their family and they needed to help them, there wouldn't be no source of quick cash. So we have to first see that we're not telling you as a homeowner, we're telling you as someone who's investing in property that this is what you would have to do. So I think trying not to see it as in I'm being told to do this, and seeing what it really is, that you're being told that you have to give your tenants the first right. And if it is a situation like you described, you still are going to have to wait. There's no guarantees that you're going to find someone to buy the house for cash. So no matter what, there is still going to be a waiting period. And so that's what I would say for that first one. It's a privilege. It's not us telling you as your home, as a homeowner, you have to give up your home. We're saying your investment properties, which you know there is a risk. Anyone who's investing in something, they know it comes with risk. There's no investment that guarantees you a profit. So that's the risk you're taking in investing in other properties other than your home. And then someone can answer the second one if they like.
I will answer that. No offense, but the tenant union, we don't sit around waiting for things to happen. We actually hit the streets and we do put in work to bring these legislation to you so that we can come to some type of agreement. And we do talk to our tenants every day about the pros and cons of being a good and bad tenant. Clearly, we're not always gonna jump on the side of the tenant when it comes to certain things, because obviously, like he said, there are good and bad tenants, but ultimately, we do talk to our tenants. We do tell them, like, if you don't clean your house, like, that's gonna lead to an eviction. Like, if you don't do certain things, like, that can give the landlord leverage to kick you out. Like, so we're not just walking around just saying we're on the tenant's side. We're looking at it on both sides.
And can I also, one of the things that we talked about was doing like a meeting like this with some of the folks from DC that could explain their process and how they do things. There is a training process for the tenants, so they understand everything that's going to happen prior to. So it's not like they're going into this blind. So there's a process that they train in, and that's one of the things we're advocating for in our community. I think Ryan, you wanted to say something.
I mean, I was just basically just to say the same thing, is that, you know, for TOPA to be a success, you know, it needs financial support, but it needs human support. So I think, you know, there are best practices, you know, for how tenants work together, address conflict, address issues, and form a cohesive, cooperative communities that, I don't know if I'd phrase it all the ways you phrased it, but address some of the issues that you're talking about. So we would work in those situations to set tenants up for success, and working together and addressing issues if tenants are having issues. And of course, we want to look under that. Just like in my building, I live in a 42 unit building, and I might talk to people about some issues, you know, and officers of our tenant union in our building, some of the issues that they're having, but also, you know, make referrals to social work and other things to try to address the underlying issues. Because just trying to evict a tenant who's having trouble in one situation could just move them to another. So we also want to focus on root causes of why someone's having trouble as well.
Did we cover the three items?
I think you also
explain to me just specifically what it is you're asking council to do. What is it you want us to do? What is the desired outcome from council?
To pass good cause eviction and the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And we understand it may not be able to happen all at once, but we want to at least get on board to know that this is going to go through at some point in the very near future.
As well.
Okay, so you're asking us to pass legislation to enable these three or two or
yes. I'm sorry.
Okay. So in order to do that, though, I think we're generally on the same page conceptually, but I still sense unreadiness regarding the actual implementation and the application of them, because they're good concepts, but there are questions beneath the line on that are going to need to be addressed. I think before we can just put the ledger on the book, put it on the books, and for us to find out what that means. If we pass a law saying you must do this or that, then we've got to be clear about who is going to oversee that and how does that get implemented and who's responsible and all of those, the mechanics of it. So I think that's sort of the next step in terms of our considerations. So as I said, I think I haven't heard any objection to the concepts, but there is work required for readiness around the actual legislation in terms of the mechanics of it.
So how do we work together to figure out the processes and how to implement? If it does pass, how do we work together to implement it and to work on the processes?
Well, I think perhaps we can identify some specific questions that we have about the implementation, the mechanics, and then look at how we can answer those or refer them or resolve them in some way. I think that's going to have to happen.
President Scott, can I ask a question of you and probably the folks in the tenants union as well? Since I've been on council, I've heard talk and conversation about, I think the group is called Housing Justice for All, that I know that Jackie has represented a council on, and obviously with Jackie leaving soon, that probably leaves a little bit of a hole there. But the reality is that is, so my concerns, very matter of factly, are the ones I've already mentioned ad nauseum to all of you. And yet this Housing Justice for All group, my understanding is that the courts are around the table. And so my question maybe for both President Scott and the folks from the tenants union is, what is the genesis of that group? Who actually runs it? And is that an opportunity to start to work through some of these bigger pictures in terms of connecting the courts to the legislative branch?
That group was started about 3, maybe 4 years ago. And we met with Judge
Doran.
There was a concern about the way the cases were being handled and the fact that there was not an assigned judge. And I think those other ones, the J4A and the other one, there may be another group too that sort of spun off from that. And it is very inclusive. There are a lot of folk on that. And they're doing some really good work. So you're asking how it connects to, and Ryan, you're on that too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've participated, Liz has participated, yeah.
Well, it just seems to me like that group, I mean, that's really, all the credit in the world. That group is what ultimately led to this right to counsel being something that, again, it wasn't just us as city council just saying we want to do this, so we're doing it. It was Volunteer Legal Services, Law New York, Legal Aid, all stepping up, putting a proposal together, getting it with your buy-in, with everyone's buy-in, and then we found the money to pay for it. But it seems like that's the crucial step that's being missed here, is that, in my opinion, and I mean this with all due respect, it feels like the tenants union is asking us to sign off on legislation that, to me, it feels like even if we voted on it and said yes tomorrow, there would be no way of effectively implementing it. And yet with right to counsel, there was a whole lot of work done at this Justice for All group level that they then came to us and said, okay, now we got to find the money, let's do it. And that's what the legislative side did. We found the money and put it on the books. But is there a way to use this group to help figure out the actual implementation part of it?
Probably, yeah, I mean, I certainly would be willing to ask them to take a look at it, but we're not, yeah, we could ask them to take a look at this.
So is this group convened by Judge Doran?
No.
Who convenes it?
Well, they have different parts of it. Some deal with housing, some deal with when you first come into the judicial system. I think there's also there's a legal portion that does research and demographics. So there's pieces to it. But ultimately Judge Doran is, he's over it.
Well, I think for the housing piece, the co-coordinators are Brian Hetherington and Tina Foster.
I know we only have a few minutes and we have one last thing that will only take like 2 or 3 minutes before we end.
Could I just propose before you do that, Jazz, that maybe an appropriate action would be to try to bring Brian and Tina into the conversation around good cause and TOPA, and trying to use that existing work group as a way to piece this together in an efficient, streamlined way. It's just a recommendation. I don't know enough about the group, but it seems to have worked with Right to Counsel pretty well.
Okay.
Allie?
Yeah, so I just wanted to real quick have a conversation. We heard a rumor that the vacancy study has kind of been delayed indefinitely, and I was wondering if we could chat about that. I know the vacancy study was passed in December of last year by many of council that's still on council now. And I think the concern that we have is we know that like the market doesn't maybe look like it did in December, but the reality being is it actually is worse because we're experiencing now a housing crisis on top of a housing crisis. And that like the market is never ideal for tenants. So the benefits of the ETPA are going to far outweigh whatever we feel like uncertainty of what the market looks like now. Thinking too as well for some of the additional protections, it's really easy to just think that ETPA is the rent stabilization, but also the protection for tenants who have disinvested units, that if the landlords are refusing to fix up the properties, that they're able to write to the state to get the rent reductions until the properties are up to date. But in addition, in a time of COVID, when employment for so many tenants is uncertain and when income is uncertain, to have that certainty and that confidence and that stability that your rent isn't gonna increase, and then an investor isn't gonna be able to do a buyout, clear out with the good cause that would go to those stabilized tenants. We really feel that the ETPA is a critical thing. And I know someone asked us, when would have been the ideal time to start the vacancy survey? And I know it got like passed in December and I'm like, man, day after. I'd love to just hear some of the rationale of where council feels like that's at and what we can do to get it started.
It's not a rumor, and I believe, I don't know whether it was Ryan or someone wrote in asking about that, and the response was that we would not be doing it at this time because of the conditions that exist throughout the community, and the reliability and value of the study was questionable. I'm inclined to agree with that. I understand that we don't want to pay for something that's not useful, that doesn't provide the information that's required. Additionally, I think the whole concern about whether it's on-site inspections and all of that probably factors into it as well in this COVID pandemic situation. So I basically understand that. I believe it's the city attorney that responded back about not moving forward with the study at this time.
President Scott, I hear that rationale, but the vacancy study is supposed to tell us if we have a vacancy emergency. And I believe that now more than ever we do, because of the lack of housing that's out there. And this protection is supposed to come into play when we have a vacancy emergency. So I personally don't think that we should wait to see if the emergency alleviates. I think now more than ever, we need the protection. So that's just, my 2 cents.
Okay.
President Scott, I saw the the note from Tim, I didn't feel, and I felt like that meant we were going to probably come back and have a conversation about it at some point, because it didn't feel like what he was saying was, you know, there's some binding law that says we can't do it. I think what he was saying was there's a lot of reasons to believe that there won't be as
We
much
shouldn't.
utility with it if we do it now versus if we did it a year ago. But to me, I mean, you know, I'm just thinking about the fact that the moratorium is going to end on August 20th. I really believe that if we're going to do it, I agree, we ought to get some data that really tells a meaningful story. I don't want to put it away in perpetuity. I mean, there's a reason why we voted for it in the first place. I'd advocate for something starting like maybe January 1 or sometime where there's some distance from the fact that there was this buildup of evictions and then the evictions happen, but not just saying that we're not going to do it forever. And the fact that January 1, it's a new calendar year, the holiday seasons are past. It seems to me like a very reasonable time to just kind of put a stake in the ground that maybe we would start it at that point.
Makes sense.
Any other thing I would say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say just for the first step, I understand the concerns about going in apartments. The first step of the vacancy study is definitely just a mass mailer. So I think that probably could be done. And of course, if there are, I think best practice is to check up and to make sure that the mailers are, you know, what the landlords are reporting are accurate. So on a random basis. So of course we would advocate that to be done safely. There are, you know, the city is doing some safe inspections. You know, in my building, you know, the inspector came out in my building and, you know, just last week and cited, you know, went in 5 units and cited 24 violations because it was important for them to come out. So I think it could be done it could be done in a safe way, but the first step would be just a mailer. And I think what Mitch is saying, you know, of course we would love to see it as soon as possible, but just something that doesn't indefinitely kick the can down the road, but set something to say like, let's, you know, and I think that would give the contractor that the city has already set up for, give them sufficient time to put it in place and start on that day.
Okay. Any additional comments, concerns?
I have one thing. So just to be clear, you would, Loretta, you'd like to see how each of these programs from start to finish, how they would work or be implemented.
Right.
Okay.
And then what's the best way for us to follow up? Should we follow up with you, Loretta, or is a work group where we really dig in deep and making sure everybody feels good and it makes sense from beginning to end, not just the concept, but the implementation? Would it be best to follow up with you, or is there, what's the best way for us to try to get on the same page, not just with the concept, but on implementation that feels fair and strong to everybody?
Well, I think it would be good though to see if we could get the Justice for All, and I forget what the other segment of that group is, if we could get them engaged to get some work done, because the work that they do is really impressive, and the number of people around the table, that might be very helpful.
Okay. And then when would be the best time to follow up with council on to see if we can, you know, try to build more common ground on not just the concept, but the implementation?
When do you think there would be something to report back based on that engagement?
So if you think the first level of engagement is with them, I would hope starting with the co-chairs of the housing piece, I think hopefully we would have some progress in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Talking through the issues, who are the people, who are the key people to engage, and through that.
Okay.
I would just strongly recommend, I think the reason I had made that recommendation is so that there's not these kind of siloed separate conversations. Whomever you start working with in the Justice for All group, I think there should be a council rep, understanding right now that with Jackie leaving fairly soon, that's something that I'm sure President Scott will either appoint someone else or maybe BJ can represent, but the bottom line is don't spend tenants union time going and having these conversations without someone from council and then having to come back and report to us. Let's all talk together.
I think that's fine. So if you guys let us know, I mean, we're happy to talk to them, just talk to them. But if there's people who want to be a key part of that process, I think just let us know. We do it together.
All right. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Have a good night.
You too.